Welcome to the show. Hernando De Soto, a conquistador who served directly under Pizarro when conquering the Incan Empire, returned to Spain ridiculously wealthy from the endeavor and sought to become the governor of Florida, which he believed would make him the richest man in the world. As many Spaniards held the belief that, like the Incan Empire in South America or the Aztec Empire in Mexico, there would be one last golden empire to plunder somewhere in the vast reaches north of the Rio Grande, which the Spanish vaguely labeled Florida, a far larger territory than the state of Florida today. In our last episode, we learned of De Soto's preparations and landing throughout the year 1539, which found him overwintering in a region called Apalachee, where the natives constantly attacked the Spanish occupiers, and while they had plenty of food, there was no gold. And so this episode opens in the spring of 1540, as De Soto, hearing tales of a wealthy empire named Kofitachequi, where a female chief held hoards of pearls and gold, resolves to leave Apalachee, consolidate his forces by sending for his men at Tampa Bay, severing his lifeline to the sea, and commit to chasing the glory of riches across the large swaths of the North American continent. This is a turning point for De Soto, as well as for the unfortunate Native American groups he will come across, as he will now enter the chiefdoms of the various Mississippian peoples, who many of us still colloquially refer to as the Mound Builders. The Mississippians will have more social stratification and a larger sphere of influence than any of the groups De Soto had come upon the year before. De Soto, in preparation, stole enough maize from the Apalachee to feed his men for the expected journey. The Apalachee took to living in swamps during the previous winter and would ambush the Spanish on occasion or even burn down their own villages if the Spanish were occupying them. They must have been relieved when the Spanish left, but were left with nothing, no seed corn to plant, a diminished population, and new diseases brought from the Old World. These conditions would give all of the enemies of the Apalachee a sudden opportunity to rewrite the politics of the region. Those groups for whom De Soto does not visit win a temporary lottery, so to speak, wherein their rivals are weakened, but eventually the diseases will affect all. De Soto and his men leave Apalachee in March of 1540, which was located in the modern-day panhandle of Florida, heading north into modern-day Georgia, where he enters the lands of a collection of Muskogean peoples, who are one component of the ancestors to a group of Native Americans the English will later call the Lower Creek. And fortunately for these Muskogeans, De Soto is moving swiftly through their territory to find Kofitachequi to the north. Nonetheless, the Spanish find villages where the people fled in advance of their arrival, a common occurrence for De Soto and his predecessor, Panfilo de Narvaez. The Spanish were still an oddity in this part of the world. Their arrival in such numbers must have been a strange and bewildering sight for the natives, as the Spanish would have an appearance and dress beyond the lived expectations for what a human being looks like to a Native American. Imagine an army of purple men suddenly appearing on your front lawn. You might expect that level of novelty to shock you a little bit. That might be similar to what a Native American would be experiencing seeing someone who had a skin tone vaguely like myself. And while the natives seem to have embraced the policy of flight over fight, on March 12, 1540, a curious incident occurred wherein a small detachment of 5 Spaniards are approached by 5 native warriors who make gestures indicating that because of their equal numbers, they wished to fight. This moment is fascinating to many of the military-minded historians and history buffs out there who often pit hypothetical warriors of mismatched times and regions against one another. Here, we actually have a 5-on-5 melee of Spanish soldiers versus Muskogean warriors. The Spanish were intrigued by the offer and accepted. The fight left 1 Spaniard dead, 3 wounded, and all 5 natives unharmed. You would think pound for pound that would settle the question of this matchup, but De Soto has some surprises in store in this regard. Don't jump to too many conclusions just yet. The Spanish travel to a number of villages that are somewhat welcoming, if not a little weary, each lending a hand to rush the Spanish straight out of their territory, until they are guided to the town named Ocute, which many historians believe to be a town later named Coweta, the principal village of the lower creek. Ocute, being one of the leading towns of the region for which the others paid tribute, had leaders with the greatest knowledge of this portion of the continent. The chiefs here confirmed the existence of Kofitachequi and another great chiefdom nearby named Coosa, one of the ancestral towns to what will become the Upper Creek Muskogee in future times. But in De Soto's time, it is the capital of a regional power with large ceremonial mounds that have taken generations to build, exalted nobles who are carried here and there, tribute coming in from all along the riverways. De Soto and his men must have been drooling at the prospect of not one, but potentially two empires to plunder if these Muskogeans could be trusted here. And as if that was not enough, the Ocute and their tributaries were enemies of Kofitachequi and were willing to assist the Spanish on their planned invasion. The Spanish find these people were generally cooperative and plant a number of crosses among the people during April of 1540. De Soto went as far as to give the chief of the Ocute a swivel gun as a gift upon leaving his country. The Spanish are given 400 people to help carry their supplies. Some sources claim this was done out of fear of what the Spanish would do if they were to stay. There's no doubt that maybe some of that is true. Now, it must be noted here, how exactly were the Spanish able to communicate with these Muskogean peoples, likely speaking a Hitchiti dialect? In our first episode on De Soto, we learned that soon after landing in Florida, a man named Juan Ortiz, one member of a party sent to look for Narvaez many years before, came forward to join the Spanish after living with the natives for years. The language he knew was likely Timucuan, and of course, Spanish. Then, when in Apalachee, they captured a boy named Perico, who told the Spaniards of Kofitachequi. Perico was familiar with the various dialects of Timucuan and Muskogean. So, the most direct way to communicate with the people of Ocute was through two interpreters. And the further on De Soto travels, the longer the chain will become. This is a best-case scenario. If either interpreter were to meet an untimely end, the Spanish would be back to using gestures. The chain was 1 man thick. During mid-April 1540, the Spanish were walking through the periphery of the tributaries of the Kofitachequi, villages empty upon their approach, and pine barrens between the villages. The men become less hopeful, as the Kofitachequi seemed to be a repeat of their time in Apalachee, only the land appeared less fruitful. They kidnap a few natives along the way, and through interrogation, De Soto learned that the Kofitachequi were forewarned of his army. De Soto loads them up with gifts and sends them to their female chief, for whom the Spanish call the Queen or the Lady of the Kofitachequi. 2 weeks go by without any real progress, and now De Soto in late April of 1540 captures a number of natives who are not as cooperative as the last bunch. His solution is to burn one to death in front of the others, who only become more resolute in their defiance. They too were then burned to death. Then on the 31st of April, the Spanish reached a river where an emissary approaches them and asks if they mean peace or war. De Soto replies the former, and the emissary carries off his response. Then a woman carried on a litter, the sources claim this is the paramount chief herself or the chief's niece, presents De Soto with a string of pearls and informs De Soto that a fleet of canoes is being prepared for his crossing. And by May 4th, his entire army is now camped inside of Kofitachequi, where the Spanish quickly receive a reality check. Kofitachequi was somewhat weakened by a plague 2 years prior, and were surrounded by enemies like the Ocute to the south. Kofitachequi was likely already in decline, and the seemingly terrible idea to invite the Spanish to their village may have been out of desperation for allies. The Spanish found that the so-called gold here was mostly copper. The natives on the verge of the Copper Age did not necessarily have different words for different metals, especially of similar color, found in the same veins and ores together. The silver turned out to be mica, a surprisingly easy mistake to make. The pearls, misshapen, were small freshwater pearls that the natives would burn to attain a black appearance that the Spanish did not approve of. De Soto, in his frustration, went so far as to go to the mortuary temple of Kofitachequi, a sacred place where the chiefly class kept their ancestors, often on an elevated mound. Here, he expected to find the most precious of treasures, and those treasures were nothing but metal objects of Spanish manufacture. De Soto believed these objects were picked from the remains of the failed Diayan colony. De Soto, a man who helped topple the Incan Empire, returned to Spain, one of the richest men in the world, and now risked his life and the lives of his extended family and friends, only to find himself looking down upon the rusted remains of what must have looked like a garage sale of objects that he could have bought or just found on the street back in Spain. Can you imagine the profound sense of failure De Soto must have felt at this moment? Now, in our last episode, we learned of the requirements the King of Spain laid out for De Soto in order to secure his position as governor, or as an expanded governor and el delatado of Florida, meaning he would have certain rights and privileges of a financial nature. De Soto thus far accomplished none of these, other than getting himself and his men to so-called Spanish Florida. At this point, many of the men, worn down by their third failed attempt to find riches in Florida, proposed that they now settle in Kofitachequi and commit to the work of building a colony. The Kofitachequi themselves must have sensed that the Spanish were contemplating staying a long while, because the chief went into hiding. This troubled De Soto, and he found a young man for whom he knew was a blood relative of the chief, and demanded that he lead a scouting party to the chief herself. The man led the Spaniards 9 or 10 miles away from the village and then killed himself. De Soto then resolves to find the chief, take her hostage to guarantee his safe passage and the passage of his men out of her territory. De Soto would not create a settlement until he followed up on the rumors of the aforementioned land of Coosa, which he was told was some 12 days away from the center of the Kofitachequi paramount chiefdom. Once he captured her, De Soto marched her village to village throughout her domain as a captive, and were able to extract through threats all they needed until they left her paramount chiefdom completely. Then along the way, they interact with a group of people who are not Muskogean in dialect, but rather this group was called the Apalachee, who were likely the ancestors to the Cherokee, who speak an Iroquoian language. Just an interesting anthropological note there. At the village of Joara, likely allies or tributaries of the Kofitachequi, the chief again, she goes missing. And fortunately for her, De Soto, now at the edge of her domain anyway, doesn't need her any longer and stops looking for her. Her chiefdom will survive De Soto, but not in the long term. As we're going to discuss later on, these Mississippian cultures, colloquially known as the Mound Builders, will not survive the introduction of novel enemies and novel diseases. On June 5th, 1540, De Soto reaches the village of Chiaha, a settlement on the very edge of the Coosa paramount chiefdom. The local chief there greeted De Soto in peace, gave him his own house to stay in, and the rest of the Spanish were allowed to camp on the trees outside of the town, where the Chiaha brought them food. The Spanish felt comfortable here, staying 2 weeks or so. The natives showed the Spanish how they collect pearls and burn them black, which seemed destructive to the Spanish, finding their natural appearance more appealing. They also found the women of Chiaha appealing, and De Soto asked the chief to give the Spanish 30 of their women. Understandably, the Chiaha women quickly went into hiding. When De Soto threatened the chief to hand over the women, the rest of the people fled as well. At this point, we might expect to see a repeat of their time in Apalachee from our first episode on De Soto. But the Spanish take back their request for the women, and they instead ask an envoy for men to help them carry their supplies out of Chiaha. Well, the natives found this a far more agreeable arrangement, and 500 men came forward to hasten the Spanish as far away from their women as possible. De Soto distributed a few gifts among the people, then left to seek out the center of the Coosa chiefdom. Along the way, he arrives at a village named Costa, who, like the Chiaha, welcomed the Spanish, who then went about stealing the corn without the consent of the chief. The Costa wasted no time and organized their warriors, who confronted the Spanish, leaving De Soto little time to formulate his response. But his knee-jerk reaction in this case was to take a native war club and then use it on his own men to punish them for stealing the corn. The Costa understood the performance, and De Soto approached the chief, took him by his hand, and led the leaders of the Costa to his own personal tent, where he then lectured them through interpreters as to the error of their ways, taking up arms against the Spanish and their rightful governor, and they were all put into chains to be dragged off in the direction of the Coosa capital. Now, we've seen this capital. In the first episode of this season, we learned about Coosa and the other mound builders as much as possible from their own point of view as it could be reconstructed. De Soto appears in that episode as a visitor in the story. He's neither the star nor certainly not the hero. And as he marches towards the center of the Coosa domain, the Gentleman of Elvas source for De Soto's expedition records that there are large fields of corn, unbroken, village to village, along with large mounds, on which hereditary chiefs, for whom the Coosa and other Mississippians considered semi-divine or at least heavily in tune with powerful spirits, lived, ruled, and where their bodies were ultimately interred. And the forests, where the fields didn't reach, were full of edible plants, such that the natives would manage even the wilderness. Coosa was a developed, settled, political entity, not just a cobbled-together set of confederated villages. Then outside of the village of Coosa itself, the Spanish witnessed the entrance of the chief of the Coosa, carried on a litter by 60 or 70 men, all themselves of the noble class. Laying on a cushion, the chief greets De Soto covered in the finest animal skins, with an elaborate, feathered headdress, followed by a string of flute players and singers, as recorded by the Gentleman of Elvas again, who was with De Soto. Such a performance was the most elaborate entrance De Soto will ever witness in this so-called land of Spanish Florida. The chief, the Spanish report, was in his mid to late 30s, not the brave and strong warrior we might associate with later Native American stereotypes. The Coosa chief himself lived in some decadence, and his people would not suffer him to touch the ground. The Coosa were also a Muskogean-speaking group, and Coosa itself will become a mother town of the Upper Creek Muskogee in a later time. But at this point in their history, their chiefs, or Mikos, enjoyed far greater status than the Mikos the English will meet 2 centuries from now, who are far more answerable to their people. This chief leads De Soto into the village of Coosa, likely the site known to archaeologists today as the Little Egypt site in Murray County, Georgia. Here, the Coosa numbered several thousand at their main village and several satellite villages that made up the core of the Coosa influence. But counting in all of their far dependencies, the Coosa chief himself may have been the head of as many as 50,000 people, stretching from eastern Tennessee to central Alabama. And here at Coosa proper, there were 3 large earthen mounds, well developed over several generations of stable leadership, and one Coosa dependency that De Soto traveled through right quick, known as Itaba, was the remnant of an even older mound-building chiefdom known as Etowah. Of all the mound-builder sites in North America, Etowah is usually ranked 3rd, only behind Moundville and Cahokia in total scale and height of the remains that we have today. Coosa was powerful, and even consolidated the formerly powerful. And as you recall, De Soto learned of Coosa while still being some 4 months away from it. They had influence, they had reputation. If gold and silver were to be found in this part of North America, this is where they were going to find it. De Soto, a man keenly aware that the Coosa were far greater than the Kofitachequi, and being a little impatient about 1.5 years into his so-called colonizing endeavor that has not yet paid off, promptly takes the chief captive. He takes the chief's family captive and went about the village and countryside enslaving all that he could take. Whereas in the past, De Soto used an incident to justify his actions. He no longer felt he had the time to wait for such an excuse. Moving forward, this will become a pattern. Suddenly, all of the chiefdom is under his thumb. The Spanish eat up all the corn they can find. Then, using the chief, they begin traveling with him in tow to pick apart his domain, taking food and making his people into slaves. Now, I've used this term paramount chiefdom a number of times in the episode already. It's worth going over. It's a modern label for an old system. In centuries past, these chiefs were often called warlords, which is an oversimplification. It's a reduction of what they actually are. In more recent times, these political entities were called confederacies, which did exist, but the Coosa and their neighbors, the Mississippians generally, they were not organized into such systems yet. Rather, they had a paramount chiefdom. One chief with his own personal villages gains an allegiance of other lesser chiefs, who in turn have their subservient villages. Anthropologist Dr. Charles Hudson claims that these lesser chiefs could control an area that they would be able to traverse in a single day, as much as 12.5 miles in radius from the center of their power. Collected under one paramount chief, politically, they began to resemble a feudal state. And on the very edge of this state, there might be found tributaries, not fully integrated into the chief's hierarchy, but rather required to pay certain tribute in food or goods in return for protection from outsiders or peace from that chiefdom itself. De Soto's people, like locusts, went about consuming the bounty of this chiefdom as they did with the ones before, until the 30th of August, 1540, when they reached the village of Ulabahali, which guarded the southern half of the Coosa domain. Here, the natives decided to take their stand and recover their chief. And it is this chief himself who came forward and told his people to stand down. De Soto extracted from them a number of the men to help carry their supplies and 20 women to be taken as slaves. This sad episode illustrates another reason why historians and anthropologists believe Mississippians thought their leaders were semi-divine, in that they were willing to surrender their own men, women, other family members over to the Spanish in return for the safety of a single paramount chief. This concern for their chief gave De Soto and company free reign over the villages they invaded, all the way until they get to a village named Talisi in modern-day Alabama, which the Spanish understood to be the southernmost point of the Coosa paramount chiefdom. Here, he learns of another chief whose domain rivaled that of the Great Coosa, and was actively trying to woo away the Talisi over to himself. This would be the great chief Tascaloosa, who sent ambassadors to Talisi to invite the Spanish to visit him. One of these ambassadors was his own son, who was only 18 years old and larger than any man in De Soto's army. De Soto gave them glass beads and accepted their invitation. He releases the Coosa chief, but De Soto keeps the chief's sister, as well as a large number of his people. The chief cried as De Soto leaves, perhaps taking some solace in knowing Tascaloosa was the type of man who begins a new mound, a founder of a dynasty, instead of himself, a weak man in what was until recently good times. On October 10, 1540, the Spanish arrive at the village of Apalachee. They are allowed to enter, and they discover that the village had around 250 buildings. Chief Tascaloosa himself sat outside of his house, wearing a headdress that stretched down to his feet. He was as large as his son, but far more muscular. Surrounding him were his advisors, and over his head a large deerskin shade, and on it was painted a large white cross on a black background. The Spanish entertained the chief with demonstrations of jousting games, and the natives in return performed dances. De Soto found Tascaloosa to be seemingly well disposed towards himself and decided to ask the chief, through the interpreters, for men to carry his supplies and for women for other purposes. Now, beside himself, Tascaloosa tells the interpreters no one ever demands things from him. Rather, it is he who makes the demands. The mood suddenly shifts, and De Soto and his men seize the giant chief. At this point, a well-practiced move, likely rehearsed in the roles assigned ahead of time. De Soto now tells Tascaloosa his demands again. The chief, not in a position to refuse, gives De Soto 400 men to carry his supplies, but tells him the women are at a settlement called Mabila, and he will have to travel there to receive them, as well as a store of food that they could have, and houses that they could live in. De Soto, now pleased with the chief's offer, not that he had a choice, gifted Tascaloosa a scarlet cloak, a pair of boots, and allowed him to ride with help on De Soto's largest horse. He was also allowed to keep his entourage around him as he traveled. Along the way, they arrive at the village of Apalachee, subservient to Tascaloosa. Here, the natives show De Soto a large dagger they took off the body of a man they killed from the Narvaez expedition. The inscription revealed it was owned by Don Teodoro, the Latinized name of a Greek man who made the pine pitch for the rafts Narvaez and company used in their desperate attempt to flee so-called Spanish Florida. Yet another reminder to De Soto what was and what could be again. Understandably, he wanted to move on quickly to Mabila. But the natives here claimed that they didn't have enough canoes to move the Spanish across the next river, likely the Alabama River today. Perhaps, emboldened by the spirit of Narvaez, the Spanish would not accept what they perceived to be a stalling tactic, and they built their own rafts to cross the river. They reached Mabila on October 18, 1540, a large town with a palisade wall all around it, with logs driven into the ground, making it up, but molded together with clay and other plaster-like materials, creating a solid structure. It had towers with arrow slits. The people welcomed De Soto in a small advance guard, with flute players and people coming out to see these odd-looking Spaniards. Everyone seemed very happy. Most of De Soto's men remained outside of the village. But the men on the inside quickly noticed that as large as Mabila was, there were more people now in the town than could possibly live in that town. And the people who were there were disproportionately fighting-age men, perhaps as many as 3,000 to 5,000 strong. De Soto's scouts told him as much ahead of time, but he claimed that he was tired of sleeping in the field. This man legitimately had no fear of the natives, no matter their number. Once in the village, Chief Tascaloosa tells De Soto that he will be staying here and no longer travel with the Spanish. The thousands of warriors now surrounding the Spanish were a clear show of force. De Soto, not a man to ever be intimidated, denied Tascaloosa his freedom, but allowed him to enter a house of the local chief and speak to the leaders of the town therein. That's where Tascaloosa remains for a long while. Juan Ortiz, the interpreter, is sent in to retrieve him and returns with the message that the Spanish were now being ordered to leave Mabila or be forced out. De Soto approaches the house with a small detachment, and he sends word that if Tascaloosa would provide more burden carriers and guides, he would leave. Tascaloosa refuses to give up any more of his people. This prompts Baltazar de Gallegos, cousin of Cabeza de Vaca, to grab the man guarding the entrance to the house. The man fought back. Baltazar draws his sword and cuts the man's arm clean off from his body. At the sight of all of this, the natives rose up, and De Soto made a hasty retreat with his small guard. 5 of his men died fighting to breach the entryway of the town, and no one escaped without injury. De Soto managed to get out and reunite with his larger force outside of the town. A bit rattled, he found 20 arrows stuck in his tunic. Tascaloosa gambled he would rather move on from his domain than attack a fortified town. The country being wide open, and most of the Tascaloosa warriors being in the town, there would be little to be gained by attacking, and everything to be saved by simply leaving, for which Tascaloosa told De Soto to do and placed no obstacles in his way. But Tascaloosa had likely never met a man like De Soto. When entering Mabila, he brought supplies and a number of natives that he had enslaved along the way to carry those supplies. These were now forfeit to Tascaloosa, and his slaves were freed, and they were given weapons to fight. They now swung the supplies around at the top of the palisade to taunt the Spanish. They played the Spanish drums victoriously, seemingly safe behind the walls. But such an insult De Soto would not condone, and shockingly, De Soto and his army prepared to storm the town, where even according to the low estimates, the Spanish would be outnumbered 5 to 1. But De Soto would not rush in with haste. The Spanish assessed the walls of Mabila, and as grand as they were, the natives lacked a fortified entryway, not having the hinged doors, swinging gates, drawbridges, etc. of a European fortress. A native palisade typically had a small, narrow break, augmented by warriors who would always keep post. De Soto knew that to the natives the horses were truly still a novelty, and he led his push into the town with his horsemen, who successfully caused the natives to lose heart and run for the shelter of the houses and the palisade towers. This is where the natives regrouped, and they pushed the Spanish out of the town several times until the Spanish finally pressed the warriors into defending themselves inside of their own structures. The Spanish, now in command of the walkways, set the buildings on fire, and the natives, rather than enveloping the Spanish, were divided and without unified command. We often hear how Native Americans used superior battle tactics to Europeans. This is an oversimplification. Given certain terrain and certain eras, this opinion can ring true. But here in 1540, with the Spanish discipline, respect for command, and resolve, this enabled them to systematically defeat a numerically superior foe in what could have been an advantageous defensive position for the natives. To the credit of the people of the Tascaloosa Paramount Chiefdom, they fought bravely for 9 hours. Towards the end, a few of the women and children even came forward to fight until there remained just 23 natives left alive, 3 men and 20 women. They approached the Spanish with gestures indicating their surrender. But when the Spanish approached, the men shot their arrows in a last stand, and the Spanish quickly killed 2 of them. The third broke free, climbed a tree, and hung himself with the string of his own bow, depriving his foe of one final kill and effectively ending the Battle of Mabila. The estimates vary wildly, but somewhere between 2,500 and 5,000 natives lay dead in the streets, burned out houses, and shattered towers of the very same town where they taunted De Soto with his own drums that very day. The Spanish too had their losses. 20 or 22 men had died in the battle, and somewhere between 148 and 200 men were seriously injured. It was nonetheless an uncontested victory for the Spanish. Historian Harvey H. Jackson claims that even with the low estimate of casualties, the Battle of Mabila would be the deadliest battle on what would become American soil until the United States Civil War, meaning De Soto and Tascaloosa, a conquistador and a Mississippian chief, set a horrific record that remained for over 3 centuries, outlasting the mound builders and Spanish Florida, unparalleled in carnage, until a time so recent to our own, we actually have photographs of the battles. And what of Chief Tascaloosa? The Spanish never saw him again, dead or alive. Many historians believe he died with his warriors, and his body likely burned beyond recognition. Had De Soto not invaded his chiefdom, Tascaloosa would have likely eaten away the power of his rivals and neighbors, and become a rising star, in contrast to the decadent chief of the Coosa. And yet, in a twist of fate, the passive nature of the Coosa chief allowed De Soto to kidnap and pillage his way straight out of Coosa territory, a harmful tragedy, but not a mortal wound to the chiefdom. We will see them again this season. Tascaloosa, in taking his stand, became the greatest adversary De Soto ever faced in his expedition. The women taken slave told the Spanish that Tascaloosa had begun organizing this attack while De Soto was still in Coosa territory. Subsequently, Tascaloosa lost everything in the process. The people of his domain who survived De Soto's invasion likely became an ancestral group to the Choctaw. Taking in the condition of the Spanish, De Soto at this point had lost over 100 men from his time of landing in 1539, so about 1/6 of his original 600 or so. His story very much parallels that of Narvaez, who made landfall at very nearly the same location in 1528. And for both men, from that point on, their forces only dwindle. Both men expending their resources to find a golden empire to conquer. De Soto felt he could still find such a place, and he tried to hide the fact that the ships that he had departed in 1539 were now told to return in 1540 to a spot in or around modern-day Pensacola. Now archaeologists have recently surmised that Mabila is in the vicinity of Marengo County, Alabama. For us, this would be a 3-hour drive to get to Pensacola. For them, a week's march or less if they knew exactly where they were going, or a rafting trip down to the ocean and then toward the rising sun. De Soto came to find that his men generally knew of this prearrangement with the ships the year prior, but found that the men were in no condition to flee to the south, and they were ignorant of exactly where they were in relation to the rendezvous point. So as it was, they were going to stay put. The Spanish occupied the ruins of Mabila, and the wounded, who comprised as much as 40% of his remaining force, needed the time to recover. His horsemen searched the countryside for food stores and came upon the satellite villages of Tascaloosa, full of wounded natives. Anyone healthy enough to run hid in the woods from the Spanish. The Spanish stole what they could, burned the fields as they left each area. The Spanish stayed about a month in Mabila, licking their wounds, before setting out, not to their boats, but to the west, leaving the residents of the former Tascaloosa chiefdom utterly destitute right before the onset of the winter of 1540-1541. And although the Spanish would leave, they were the harbingers of a disastrous period found in the archaeological record known as the Mississippian Shatter Zone, which begins not by coincidence here in 1540. Before De Soto, a large portion of North America, north of the Florida Peninsula, hosted a bustling population of rival mound-building chiefdoms with settled populations, hierarchies, and rich traditions. For those Mississippians De Soto interacted with directly, the damage is immediate and obvious: Kofitachequi, Coosa, and now Tascaloosa. But in general, it would be the old world diseases brought by the Spanish unintentionally, which remained in their absence, and spread to chiefdoms that the Spanish would never get a chance to see. The Mississippian chiefdoms from this point on will be stressed to a breaking point. When later colonizers find egalitarian forest-dwelling people in some of these areas, they will assume the natives had always lived this way, giving rise to the noble savage myth. No, instead, the settlers of the 17th century were witnessing what you could perhaps call a post-apocalyptic world for the Mississippians, as native societies were just hanging on and rebuilding from the effects of the 16th century. Join me next time for our last episode on De Soto, as he travels west, chasing a dream for which he has spent the last 2 years pursuing at great cost to all involved. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give me a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to. This was the Other States of America History Podcast. I'm Eric Yanis. Thank you for listening.